Here come the illustrations for Chapter 13 and 14 of Volume 2 of Among the Multihulls. 14 minutes. These are hippos, the most dangerous of all East African wildlife. They kill or injure more people than any other critter. They even attack the local fishing canoes, and I was never before asked to design against such a hazard. Yes, at the invitation of the World Bank, this pea-green boat designer is off to East Africa. For 5 weeks in 1980, I traveled with a team of World Bank experts through Kenya and Burundi, and here we are, waiting ashore at a place called Kazingatini, in our business suits with our briefcases and our shiny shoes, trying to assess the local fisheries resources. And at times like this, I felt about as useful as a whistle on a hand plow. I mean, who was I to try to recommend a better boat for people that were operating at this level of economy? The sail is literally stuck together, plastic sheets, feed bags, anything they could find, but note the traditional lateen rig. This is a fish landing site, a fish market on Lake Victoria in the Nyanza Gulf, which is Kenya territory of Lake Victoria. These are Kikuyu people, and these are their so-called sessi canoes. After fishing for much of the night, the men bring their catch to certain beaches, and the women come down to the landings and buy the fish. The women are the fish marketing system. The men have their sails triced up aloft in order to make room for the women to come down and haggle with them over the price of fish. No middleman. And the boats, oh my, they were making new boats out of pieces of old boats, pieces of any size and shape. And this type of construction requires a very noble species of African mahogany, long, wide planks ripped out of the log by hand, and the material was becoming very scarce. And that turned out to be the reason I was there. The way these things were built was flat amazing. Notice that there are no frames in this boat, just thwarts, and these long, odd-shaped planks are fastened together with strips of tin flashing tacked over the seams to hold the boats together. These guys were risking their lives in these things every night out on Lake Victoria. They used strips of inner tube underneath the strips of tin. This is a master boat builder and his tools, all of them. He told me that he had to pay exorbitant prices for his wood because there was none left in Kenya. It had to be smuggled in from Uganda. And it was illegal to cut it even there. When building of less noble species, stuff that would rot right away, they compensated with massive construction so as to allow for decomposition. And of course, the boats now became extremely heavy, really too heavy to paddle, even too heavy to sail in the light winds that they enjoyed. Trying to offer some alternative to wooden boats, the World Bank had financed a project for building canoes out of welded steel, which were also too heavy to paddle or sail, and so required outboard motors which could not be kept running. So the boats were stacked up, disused on the once pristine beaches. And I was being asked to solve this problem. By far the best boats going were their traditional dugout canoes. They were long and narrow and light so that they were easy to paddle. They were very durable because of their elegant species. But dugout canoes are extremely wasteful because the pile of chips is bigger than the boat. You can only get one boat out of a log. They are a genetic assault on the forest because only the very best trees are selected for dugouts. The good ones were long gone, and there were millions of people dependent on the fish. But really now, what in tarnation was I supposed to do about it? Well, I had a chance to come home and think about it. And to think about where this place was. This is Africa. And we'll zoom in on the very heart of it, the Rift Valley Lakes, Lake Victoria in the upper middle, and Lake Tanganyika, the long skinny one below that. Very beautiful territory, the heart of Africa. But how was I to make a difference there? Well, I designed this boat. I still have the model today. The most extremely simple canoe form that did not have to be independently stable because they operated them always as catamarans, two hulls strapped together for fishing with a giant net between. And of course I thought we could build it the same way we had built Sib out of this new so-called constant camber system. The same method we used when building Sib. In the upper left is a model of the mold used to make the panels which are in the foreground. There's a single panel here in the foreground and a couple of canoes in the middle, and I took this whole business back to Africa in 1981 and tried to explain to the people there that I thought we could build these canoes there. I thought the method would be easy to learn and easy to teach. And this guy believed me. This is Jose Shredder, one of the most enigmatic characters I've ever met, an old Africa hand. I talk a lot about him in the book. He was a great guy, and he gave me my first real break with constant camber. He convinced the World Bank to put up the dough for us to build a little factory in Burundi for producing these canoes. So I came home while Jose Shredder built the factory. Spending World Bank money, he bought some wonderful equipment in Europe. This is a big bandsaw, which we use for ripping out the strips of veneer that were laminated into these constant camber panels. We hired some of the local tribespeople, and this bandsaw had a power feed, and we were able to produce plenty of material using the local cypress, which was otherwise underutilized. And here are those strips of wood being diagonally laminated onto the constant camber mold. 3 layers, glue between the layers. Now here's the finished panel. Up on the ceiling, notice our so-called matched platen, a fiberglass panel that would come down on top of the wood layers with wet glue between and seal up around the edges, and with the air evacuated from between the two molded surfaces, we would have a vacuum press to squeeze all of those layers down on one another tightly to perform a wonderful clamping operation. And here's the panel after being removed from the mold, the inside of the panel. What it is a giant sheet of plywood pre-laminated into a constant camber or compound curvature. Now we could cut out one whole side in one piece, a giant half of a pea pod for this canoe. And the specific profile shape of each panel was determined by the model work. And the scrap that was left over in the right foreground here was used for making paddle blades. Here the two panels are assembled down their center line seam in the stitch and glue fashion. And yes, we actually had 2 molds for 2 different canoes of different configuration. This one is independently stable. It's wide enough to be used as a monohull. The other one is intended only for use as a catamaran, easier to paddle than this one. Here's the catamaran canoe hull during assembly, right side up. Note that the frames on the right are used only for assembly, just something to rest the panels on while stitching them together down their centerline seam. Otherwise, these hulls were entirely frameless. We did not have to teach people how to frame up in order to build a boat. Of course, there was some finishing involved, these little foredecks and the shear stringers, and some shaping, simple cleaning up, very modest interiors because these are fishing boats. Compared to a dugout canoe, these boats were very lightweight and at least as strong. I mean, show me another canoe where you can get 6 guys standing on the keel when she's upside down. In the background to the right, you can see the mold, which we made in the shop, and the matched platen hanging from the ceiling. Very minimal investments in setting up for producing these canoes. Most of our trainees were Hutu tribespeople. This was my friend Ntarindwa, who was trying to learn English. He'd come into the shop in the morning, give me a high five, and say, "Hi, Jim, how's life?" No previous experience in working with tools, and sadly he cut off his finger in the shop. No previous experience in working with tools. And this was Boogaloo, who always wore that cap in equatorial Africa. And he's the bravest man I ever saw. He walked up to a horrible flame with a fire extinguisher and snuffed it out. See the chapters for details. Oh, he also fell into the saw pit and broke his leg. Hey, launching day for the first monohull canoe. The whole fisheries department showed up. Josie Schroeder is holding one of our new paddles, but in the traditional shape with the pointed blade. Of course, they could also be used for weapons, nowadays for fending off the hippos. Sliding into Lake Tanganyika. We all went out for a paddle. We could get 9 guys in that canoe, 24 feet long. The catamaran canoes were 27 feet long, and the fishermen marveled at how easily they paddled. They did not need engines. Their outboard motors for the steel canoes and some of the heavy dugouts were costing them half of their income, and they didn't have far to go. Only 3.5 miles to the middle of the lake, and if they went beyond that, they got into fishing wars with the people on the other side from Zaire. Here's the double canoe coming in after its first night of fishing. The long poles are used for suspending a net of 10 meters square beneath the boat, and bright lights are shown down into the water, kerosene mantle lamps for attracting the fish. Small sardine-sized fish called ndagala. Of course, we were anxious for a report. These guys had already sold their catch, keeping just enough for their families. When we asked about their canoe, it was translated for me. This band said, "Bwana, this is a canoe that does not need an engine." And the last I heard, they had built some 300 of those catamaran units and sold some of them to other countries. But what happened to that project is kind of a long, sad story, which is told in the text. Don't need to tell it here. But I do have one for you coming up in chapter 15. See you there.